Hi, my name is Kathy Fitzgerald, and I am a parent of a young lady with developmental disabilities and a professional having worked in the field for a little over 30 years. And we're going to talk about Section B, which is what are waivers and how do we get one? Waivers are really a way for the state to receive compensation from the federal government. In our state, every state is a little bit different depending on the state and the economy of the state. So West Virginia, for example, would have a much higher match than the state of Alaska because we have been pretty flush for many years with funding. So our rate of compensation from the federal government is 50%. So the federal government pays for a 50%, and the state of Alaska pays for 50% of the cost of providing services for comprehensive services, which is what a waiver is all about. But families do waive their privacy. So you need to know that your information about your child's income is a matter of record that you need to share with the state because you're applying for and asking for service. So I always say what we waive as families is our privacy, especially if we're fortunate enough to have services where somebody comes into your home to help your child. What happens in your home is kind of out there for everybody. So anyway, that's what we as families waive. Other than that, we really don't waive anything. We're fortunate enough to receive services. Let's talk a little bit about where waivers come from. They really came about in the Reagan administration and were a result of a family organization or an advocacy organization called Family Voices, working with that three-legged stool that we talked about to advocate for services to be able to happen in the community as opposed to in institutions. Many of you will remember or have had a chance to go back and look at the old Geraldo Rivera expose on institutions in New York and some of the other horror stories that we heard. And so best practice was really you didn't want to be in an institution. You wanted to be in the community like everybody else. And we needed a way to make that happen. And during the Reagan administration, Family Voices were able to make the case to him in particular, that it was not only an economical savings to the country, but it was also the right thing to do, the human thing to do. I like to think of the process of applying for a waiver and obtaining a waiver is going through a series of doors. And the first door that you have to go through is that eligibility door. Remember, we have to meet the federal and state criteria for an eligibility for a DD eligibility and have to be deemed DD eligible. So the second door that you need to get through is the DD registry and eligibility. So you need to have completed that paperwork and have a score significantly high enough that you would be selected to come off of that wait list or that registry for service. The third door is the financial eligibility door. So remember we talked about eligibility being based on income level. All of Medicaid is based on an income level of service, and so having to be able to prove that you meet that criteria of eligibility financially. In the state of Alaska, you can have no more on hand than $2,000 at any one time. The only exception for that would be during PFD term. And then you have something like 90 days to expend that PFD dividend down so that you're not showing more than $2,000 in your holdings. So the fourth door is the disability door. So to get through that, you have to have one of the 4 magical diagnoses or other category. We'll talk about that in a minute. So those diagnoses are, in order to receive a waiver in the state of Alaska, an intellectual and developmental disabilities waiver, is cerebral palsy, autism, an intellectual disability, or a seizure disorder. And then there's the 5th category, which I find extremely important and useful in our state. That's the other category. So let's talk about what the other category might be. You could have fetal alcohol effect or fetal alcohol syndrome and function very much like somebody with autism or somebody with an intellectual disability, but that's really not your diagnosis. So if I like to think of it like a duck. So if you walk like a duck and you quack like a duck, but you're a goose, you're probably going to fit the other categories because you look like and you act like one of the other categories. However, you don't have that particular diagnosis. One of the most important things that I would want you to know is that it really is not so much about your diagnosis, although those are critical. It's really about the functionality within that diagnosis process. The 5th door that you need to get through is really the level of care door. Remember that when we talked in section A about the level of care, this is where it becomes important that that whole need to meet an institutional level of care. So if you think of it, but for waivered services in the community, this individual would be in an institution, developmental disability or nursing home kind of an institution. So the waitlist assessment criteria that hopefully the STAR program has helped you fill out will help you be able to show on paper where you or your loved one is really functioning. Because if you don't meet that institutional level of care, you're not going to be able to receive a Medicaid waiver, which means you will be limited to what DD grant support services might be able to fund. In order for the state to make a determination whether you meet an institutional level of care or not, they use a tool currently called Inventory for Client and Assessment Planning, or ICAP. Um, it is very specific. It asks you such things as pincer grasp. Does the person have a pincer grasp? Those kinds of really specific, can you functionality, can you do this? Um, I want to make sure and to caution everyone that the ICAP tool, first of all, it only looks back 3 months. So making sure that you have documented and talked about um, incidences of health and safety that somebody might have with autism, for example, is critical because behaviorally, um, ICAP only looks back 3 months. So I want to talk about the importance of ICAP and how critical it is. So in order to implement the ICAP process, they have people who come out and actually interview, in some cases, the individual themselves, always the guardian or parent, and 2 other people who know that individual well. So the care coordinator will ask you who you would like to have as part of that ICAP process. And you want to make sure that the people that are being interviewed by the assessor really knows the individual well and answers those questions based on that person's worst day. So if you think about it from a glass half full or half empty, this is a case where you really want to be prepared for what you've seen on a really bad day, because we can't predict when those bad days are coming, and we want to make sure that people understand that there are those bad days out there. So looking at can Kara, for example, my daughter, can she put on her shoes? If the assessor asked me, can Kara put on her shoes? I would say, as a parent, sure, she can put on her shoes. But what I probably should tell you is they're 99% of the time they're on the wrong feet. Her socks aren't pulled up, and they're slip-ons. So if we're not making sure that the socks are up and that they're on the right feet, then she gets really bad blisters. And because she's autistic, she doesn't tell anybody, and then we have really bad sores. And so understanding how you answer those questions, you really need to think of it from the perspective of, can Kara put on her shoes? If nobody else was in the room, could Kara put on her shoes correctly? And the answer would be no. But many parents and teachers are guilty too, because they love our kids. They'll say, well, sure, they can put on their shoes. But you don't think about all of the cues, verbal or physical cues, that you give somebody on a day-to-day basis. And you really have to think about it. If there were nobody there to give the cues, could they, in fact, do that task? And then finally, the last door that we have to get through is the state funding door, whether or not the state has the funding to, in fact, pull people off of that wait list and begin to provide services for them. At the current time, we are removing 50 individuals per year based on that state funding. We hope that in the future we'll be able to go back to removing up to 200 people a year, as we have done in the past before our budget was so tight. So we hope this segment helped you understand a little bit about Medicaid and the waiver workings. The next section will be about the process and the flow, if you would, the flow sheets or the flow chart of how that paperwork happens. Because we all know in the bureaucratic system, there's lots of paperwork. And so how we get through that paperwork and how that flows from developing a plan of care into implementation. Thank you.